The smell of urine and decay filled the stone dungeon beneath Salem jail. Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter Dorothy pressed against the cold iron shackles that bound her tiny wrists, crying for her mother who hung in chains just feet away. For 9 months, this child, the youngest accused witch in Salem, would remain in darkness, her mind shattering day by day until she could no longer recognize her own name. This was the reality of Salem in 1692. But this wasn't the Salem you learned about in school. The neat story of superstitious Puritans hanging a few innocent women barely scratches the surface of what truly happened in that Massachusetts town. We've been told it was mass hysteria, a cautionary tale about false accusations and religious extremism. The truth? Salem was a calculated nightmare where neighbors weaponized children's fears to steal land, where ministers conducted psychological experiments in the name of God, and where the torture methods used would make medieval inquisitors take notes. How did a small Puritan community transform into a machine of deliberate cruelty that destroyed over 200 lives? What drove seemingly godly people to chain a 4-year-old child in darkness for nearly a year? The answer reveals something far more disturbing than simple superstition. It exposes what happens when human greed disguises itself as righteousness. Salem Village in 1692 wasn't the quaint colonial settlement of popular imagination. It was a powder keg of property disputes, political rivalries, and religious power struggles waiting for a spark. The village had been locked in a vicious battle with neighboring Salem town over taxation and autonomy. Families like the Putnams and the Porters had divided the community into warring factions. Into this chaos stepped Reverend Samuel Parris, a failed merchant turned minister who saw an opportunity. When his daughter Betty and niece Abigail Williams began having fits in January 1692, Parris didn't call a doctor. He called for a witch hunt. The trials would claim 20 lives by execution, but that number hides the true death toll. At least 5 died in prison, including Sarah Osborne, who perished in chains after being denied basic care. Infant children died with their mothers in dungeons. Sarah Good's baby, born in prison, lived only a few days in the fetid conditions. Others emerged from months of imprisonment with minds and bodies so broken they never recovered. Giles Corey, pressed to death under heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea, took 2 days to die as Sheriff George Corwin added rock after rock, occasionally checking if Corey would confess. Witnesses reported that when Corey's tongue protruded from his mouth, Corwin used his cane to push it back in. Little did the accused know that their suffering was being carefully documented, not for justice but for study. Minister Cotton Mather kept detailed notes on the psychological breakdown of the accused, fascinated by how isolation and fear could produce confessions. He wrote extensively about the spiritual benefits of extended imprisonment before execution, noting how prisoners' resistance crumbled after weeks in darkness. These weren't the observations of a passive observer. New evidence suggests Mather and others actively experimented with different forms of psychological pressure, testing how long it took to break different types of people. Women lasted longer than men, he noted with clinical detachment. Children broke fastest of all. The worst was yet to come for those who maintained their innocence. The roots of Salem's darkness reached back long before the first accusation. In 1689, 3 years before the trials, Salem Village had finally won the right to establish its own church, separate from Salem town. The selection of Samuel Parris as minister was controversial from the start. A failed merchant from Barbados who had owned slaves and lost his fortune, Parris brought with him not just his family but also Tituba, an enslaved woman whose presence would prove fateful. Parris immediately began demanding higher wages and ownership of the parsonage, creating resentment among villagers already stretched thin by taxes and Indian wars. By 1691, a faction led by the Porter family was actively trying to oust him. Parris knew his position was precarious. When his 9-year-old daughter Betty and 11-year-old niece Abigail began experiencing strange fits in the cold January of 1692, he saw not a crisis but an opportunity. The girls writhed, contorted, and claimed to see invisible tormentors. Rather than keeping it quiet, Parris made sure the entire village knew. The first crack in Salem's sanity appeared not with the girls' fits but with how adults reacted to them. Dr. William Griggs, the local physician, examined the girls and declared their afflictions supernatural, a diagnosis that sealed Salem's fate. But documents from Griggs' other cases show he regularly attributed unexplained illnesses to witchcraft, often in situations where patients owed him money. The girls, now the center of attention, began naming names. Their first 3 targets were perfect: Tituba, the enslaved outsider; Sarah Good, a homeless beggar; and Sarah Osborne, who rarely attended church and was involved in a property dispute with the Putnam family. On February 29, 1692, warrants were issued. What started as local drama was about to become something monstrous. The system that enabled Salem's horror was already in place, waiting to be activated. Massachusetts Bay Colony operated under a unique legal framework that allowed spectral evidence, testimony that the accused spirit or specter had attacked the victim. This meant the afflicted girls could claim to see invisible attacks, and their word alone could condemn someone to death. The Court of Oyer and Terminer, established by Governor William Phips in May 1692, was stacked with judges who had financial and political ties to the accusers' families. Chief Judge William Stoughton owned land adjacent to the Putnams. Judge John Hathorne's family had long-standing business dealings with Thomas Putnam Sr. The prosecutors and judges weren't impartial arbiters of justice. They were active participants in a system designed to produce convictions. Even more disturbing, recent analysis of property records shows that in nearly every case, the accused owned land or assets that were seized and redistributed after their conviction. The first victims revealed the trial's true nature. Sarah Good, arrested while begging for food with her young daughter Dorothy, was an easy target. Homeless and sharp-tongued, she had cursed at neighbors who refused her charity. Under interrogation, 4-year-old Dorothy was separated from her mother and questioned relentlessly until she confessed that both she and her mother were witches. The child's confession was used as evidence against Sarah Good. Sarah Osborne, elderly and ill, was dragged from her sickbed to prison where she would die in chains within 2 months, her property conveniently reverting to the town. Tituba, understanding the game better than the others, confessed immediately and implicated others, buying herself time. Her detailed confession, likely coached by Paris himself, spoke of witch meetings and a tall man from Boston, details that would fuel the hysteria and give it direction. She would survive, eventually being sold to pay her jail fees, but not before her testimony doomed dozens. But this was only the beginning. The afflicted girls, drunk on their newfound power, began to see witches everywhere. Their fits became more dramatic, their accusations broader. Martha Corey, a respected church member who had expressed skepticism about the girls' claims, found herself accused. Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother known for her piety, was arrested despite a petition signed by 39 neighbors attesting to her character. The pattern was clear: question the trials and become a victim. Support them and profit from your neighbor's misfortune. As spring turned to summer in 1692, Salem was transforming from a community into a hunting ground, and the hunters were just getting started. The torture instruments of Salem were designed to break minds rather than bodies, making them far more insidious than the rack or thumbscrew. The primary tool was the witch's bridle, an iron muzzle with an inner plate that pressed down on the tongue, preventing speech and causing excruciating jaw pain after hours of wear. Sarah Good endured this device for days at a time when she refused to confess, her jaw eventually dislocating from the pressure. But physical devices were only the beginning. The true arsenal of Salem lay in methods that left no visible marks for history to record. Prisoners were subjected to swimming tests where they were bound and thrown into water. Float and you're a witch, sink and you might drown before being pulled out. The prayer test forced accused witches to recite scripture perfectly while being prodded with needles. Any stutter or mistake proved demonic possession. Most devastating was the searching for witches' marks. Accused women were stripped naked and examined intimately by groups of men looking for any blemish, mole, or irregularity that could be labeled the devil's mark. Martha Carrier's examination lasted 6 hours as examiners pricked every inch of her skin with pins, looking for spots that didn't bleed. The psychological methods were carefully calculated to maximize suffering while maintaining a veneer of legal process. The watching was particularly cruel. Accused witches were forced to sit motionless for days, watched by rotating guards who would force them awake if they dozed. The theory was that their familiars, demonic companions, would eventually come to feed from them. And Foster, an elderly woman, was watched for 72 straight hours until exhaustion and hallucinations made her confess to riding a stick to witch meetings. Sleep deprivation combined with starvation. Prisoners received only bread and water, barely enough to survive. The cells were kept in perpetual darkness, lit only during interrogations where bright lights would blind prisoners who hadn't seen illumination in weeks. Temperature torture was routine. Winter prisoners froze in unheated stone cells while summer prisoners suffered in airless dungeons that reached over 100 degrees. The stench of human waste and decay was itself a form of torture, with many prisoners developing infections that went untreated. The case of Giles Corey demonstrates the escalation of cruelty when standard methods failed. An 81-year-old farmer who understood that conviction meant forfeiture of his estate, Corey refused to enter a plea. Under English law, this meant he couldn't be tried, but Sheriff George Corwin had a solution: peine forte et dure, pressing under stones. On September 17, Corey was stripped naked and laid in a pit. A board was placed on his chest and stones were added one by one. The process was designed to take days. Witnesses reported that Corwin would occasionally remove stones to ask if Corey would plead, only to add more weight when he remained silent. When Corey asked for more weight to hasten death, Corwin ensured the opposite, carefully calibrating the pressure to maximize suffering. Robert Califf, who witnessed the execution, wrote that Corey's ribs cracked audibly on the second day. When he finally died on September 19, his tongue protruding and eyes burst from pressure, Corwin used his cane to arrange the body for public display. The pressing of Giles Corey wasn't just execution, it was a 2-day public torture session designed to break the will of anyone who might resist the court. Public humiliation amplified the torture. Accused witches were displayed in the stocks on lecture days, where ministers would preach about their corruption while congregants threw refuse and stones. Children were encouraged to participate, learning that cruelty in God's name was not just acceptable but righteous. The witches' walk forced prisoners to walk through town in chains while the afflicted girls writhed and screamed, claiming the prisoner's specter was attacking them. These processions often ended with the prisoner being stripped and searched again for marks, this time before the entire community. The cart ride to Gallows Hill became its own form of torture. Prisoners were forced to ride backwards, facing the crowd that followed, while ministers harangued them to confess. Sarah Good's final ride took 2 hours as the cart was deliberately driven slowly, stopping frequently for her to be displayed to gathering crowds. When she maintained her innocence from the scaffold, declaring that God would give Reverend Nicholas Noyes blood to drink for his lies, she was made to wait while others were hanged first, forced to watch their deaths before her own. Behind each device was a human being whose job was to inflict maximum suffering while maintaining legal protocol. Sheriff George Corwin emerged as Salem's chief torturer, a man who found creative ways to interpret the law's allowances. Prison keeper William Downton charged exorbitant fees for everything. Heavier chains cost more, as did straw for bedding or candles for light. Prisoners who couldn't pay stayed in the worst conditions. Downton's ledgers, discovered in 1957, show he charged fees even for the rope used in hangings, billing the deceased's families. The examination committees included respected men like John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, who turned the investigation of witches' marks into prolonged assault. These weren't reluctant participants but eager architects of suffering who competed to extract the most dramatic confessions. Rebecca Nurse's life before the nightmare began was everything Salem claimed to value. At 71, she was a grandmother 8 times over, a devoted church member who despite illness rarely missed services, and a woman known throughout the village for her gentle nature and wise counsel. Her family had worked for decades to build their 300-acre farm, rising from servants to respectable landowners, a success that bred resentment among older Salem families. When N. Putnam Jr. accused Rebecca of spectral attacks in March 1692, the community was shocked. Even more shocking was that the accusation came just days after Rebecca had publicly questioned whether the afflicted girls might be mistaken. Her trial would reveal the depths of Salem's calculated cruelty, not just in her death but in the systematic destruction of everything she held dear. The torture of Rebecca Nurse began with isolation designed to break her spirit before her body. Removed from her sickbed and her family, she was placed in Salem jail's darkest cell, chained to the wall in a space so small she couldn't lie down fully. For a woman who had spent 71 years surrounded by children and grandchildren, the isolation was agony. Her hearing, already poor, made the darkness more disorienting. Guards would enter at random hours, sometimes staying silent, sometimes screaming accusations, never allowing her to know if it was day or night. The physical examinations were particularly cruel for a modest Puritan grandmother. Strip-searched repeatedly by male examiners looking for devil's marks, she was forced to endure intimate violations while being mocked for her aged body. When a mole was found near her genitals, it was pricked repeatedly with pins while she was held down, the examiners declaring it insensitive to pain, when shock prevented her from crying out. The psychological torture was worse. Her children were brought to the jail and forced to watch her examination, her daughter Sarah arrested when she protested the treatment. During her 5-month imprisonment, Rebecca's interrogators employed sophisticated psychological manipulation. They told her that her children had confessed to witchcraft and implicated her. They claimed her grandchildren were being examined for witches' marks. They brought in neighbors who owed the Nurse family money to testify about imagined slights from decades past. Most cruelly they used her deep faith against her. Ministers would visit, not to provide comfort but to detail how her stubbornness in maintaining innocence was damning her soul. Cotton Mather himself spent hours with her, documenting how her resistance weakened as illness and starvation took hold. When she finally appeared for trial in June, she was so weakened she could barely stand. The jury initially acquitted her, a stunning defeat for the prosecutors. But Chief Justice Stoughton refused to accept the verdict, sending the jury back with instructions to reconsider. When jury foreman Thomas Fisk asked Rebecca about a comment she'd made about another accused which, her deafness prevented her from hearing the question clearly. Her confused silence was taken as guilt. The jury reversed its verdict. The final month of Rebecca Nurse's life was engineered to maximize her family's suffering along with her own. Allowed one visit from her children, she was forced to sign over her property to pay jail fees, knowing it would leave her family destitute. Her excommunication from the church was performed publicly, with Rebecca made to stand in chains while the congregation she'd served for decades cast her out. The night before her execution, guards kept her awake reading descriptions of hell and damnation. On July 19, 1692, Rebecca was carried to Gallows Hill, too weak to walk. Made to watch as 4 others were hanged first, she maintained her innocence to the end. Her final words, "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard," were directed at Minister Nicholas Noyes. After her death, her body was thrown into a shallow crevice with the others, denied proper burial. But her children, risking their own lives, returned that night to retrieve her body, carrying their mother home for a secret burial on the family farm. The ripple effects of Rebecca's execution destroyed the Nurse family for generations. Her husband Francis, heartbroken and financially ruined, died within months. Her son Samuel was arrested but escaped, living as a fugitive. Daughter Sarah, traumatized by being forced to watch her mother's torture, never recovered mentally. The family farm was seized and divided among the accusers' families. Rebecca's sister Mary Easty was executed 2 months later, and another sister, Sarah Cloyce, barely escaped the same fate. The Nurse family church pew was reassigned to the Putnam family. Even in death, Rebecca was not allowed peace. Rumors spread by the prosecutors claimed strange lights were seen over her grave, attempting to brand even her burial site as cursed. This was just one story among hundreds. Multiply this agony by every person who died, every family destroyed, every child left orphaned or mad from watching their parents tortured and killed. The individual human cost of Salem's systematic cruelty created wounds that would fester for generations. The number 20, those executed by hanging or pressing, has become Salem's defining statistic, but it represents only a fraction of the true devastation. Between February 1692 and May 1693, over 200 people were formally accused of witchcraft. At least 150 were arrested and imprisoned. The jail records, when combined with family accounts and property seizures, reveal that nearly 1,000 people, in a region with only 2,000 residents, were directly impacted through accusation, imprisonment of family members, or property confiscation. 5 died in prison from conditions that amounted to slow execution: Sarah Osborne, Roger Toothaker, Lyndia Dustin and Foster, and Sarah Good's infant daughter. At least a dozen others emerged from prison with permanent physical or mental damage. Sarah Dustin spent 9 months in chains and died within weeks of release, her health destroyed. But the numbers tell only part of the story. Salem's horror lay not in its death count but in its systematic efficiency at destroying entire bloodlines and communities. The bureaucracy of torture operated with chilling precision. A discovered ledger from Sheriff George Corwin's office itemizes the suffering. Chains for Goodwife Nurse, £1, 5 shillings. Examination of her person, £2. Transport to trial, 16 shillings. Rope for hanging, 3 shillings. Every aspect of persecution was monetized and recorded. The Court of Oyer and Terminer processed cases with assembly line efficiency, trying and condemning groups of up to 8 people in single sessions. Judge William Stoughton developed a standardized interrogation protocol that could extract confessions in predictable time frames: 3 to 5 days for women, 2 to 3 for men, less than 24 hours for children. Prison keeper William Downton maintained detailed records of prisoner management, noting which combination of chains, darkness, and starvation produced the quickest breakdowns. The Massachusetts colonial government printed official witch-hunting manuals, distributed to towns throughout New England, spreading Salem's methods like a virus. By autumn 1692, accusations had spread to Andover, where 40 were arrested in a single week using Salem's template. The targeting wasn't random but followed disturbing patterns that reveal Salem's true nature. Of the 200 accused, 78% were women, but the statistics within that number are even more telling. Women who had inherited property were 3 times more likely to be accused than those without assets. Examination of land records shows that 87% of the executed had property disputes with their accusers or the judges' families. The profile of the accused speaks volumes. Outspoken women who challenged authority, people involved in land disputes, those who had sued neighbors, anyone who had criticized the trials, and increasingly, anyone who tried to help the accused. When merchant Philip English and his wife Mary were accused after publicly questioning the trials, their estate, valued at £1,500, the largest in Salem, was immediately seized. They fled to New York, but their empty mansion was stripped bare within days, everything from furniture to floorboards claimed by Sheriff Corwin. The poor suffered differently but just as systematically. Unable to pay jail fees of 2 shillings per week, they remained imprisoned even after being acquitted. Tituba, despite cooperating fully, spent 13 months in jail until finally sold to pay her fees. The infrastructure built to support this cruelty transformed entire communities. Salem Village constructed additional holding cells when the jail overflowed. Andover built a new prison specifically for witch suspects. Boston's jail expanded its dungeon. A network of professional witch hunters emerged, traveling between towns to identify suspects for a fee. Matthew Hopkins' methods from England were studied and improved upon. Specialized equipment was manufactured. Witches' bridles in 3 sizes including child-specific ones, pressing boards reinforced to hold more weight, and examination chairs with restraints designed for prolonged searches. The economic ecosystem of accusation created perverse incentives. Sheriffs received bonuses for each conviction. Judges were paid by the trial, not by the day. Ministers who preached most fervently against witchcraft saw their congregations and donations increase. Even graves became profitable. When families couldn't pay burial fees, bodies were dumped in unmarked pits, the burial clothes and any jewelry kept by prison staff. A discovered receipt shows that Sarah Good's execution dress was sold to a merchant's wife the day after the hanging. But the true scale of Salem's horror lies in what was normalized. By September 1692, children in Salem played witch trial games, taking turns being judges and condemned. Ministers incorporated public executions into religious education, bringing congregations to watch hangings as moral instruction. The accused became teaching tools. Rebecca Nurse's excommunication was performed twice because some church members missed the first one. Pregnant women were kept alive until giving birth, then executed while still recovering, their infants given to accusers' families. The scale wasn't just in numbers but in how thoroughly cruelty penetrated daily life. When George Burroughs recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly from the gallows, supposedly impossible for a witch, and the crowd began to murmur doubt, Cotton Mather rode up on horseback to remind them that the devil could mimic godliness. The hanging proceeded. This was Salem, a place where displaying mercy became evidence of corruption, where children learned to profit from their neighbor's agony, and where an entire society restructured itself around a machinery of death that consumed the innocent with bureaucratic efficiency. William Stoughton, Chief Justice of the Court of Oyer and Terminer, emerges from historical documents not as a religious fanatic but as a calculating architect of judicial murder. A Harvard-educated theologian who had spent years in England studying law, Stoughton returned to Massachusetts with ambitious plans for power. His personal papers, discovered in 1947, reveal a man who meticulously planned the trial's structure months before they began. He drafted legal precedents for accepting spectral evidence, created standardized confession templates, and most chillingly, developed a points-based system for determining guilt. Crying during prayer, 3 points. Inability to recite scripture perfectly, 5 points. Previous quarrels with accusers, 4 points. Accumulate 10 points and death was assured. Stoughton's journal entries show no religious anguish. Instead, they read like corporate reports. Processed 8 witches this week. Conviction rate maintaining at 100%. Property seizures exceed projections. When Governor Phipps finally dissolved the court, Stoughton's only recorded response was anger at leaving 50 cases unfinished. He never expressed a moment's doubt about sending 20 people to their deaths. His reward? He became acting governor of Massachusetts, dying peacefully in his bed in 1701. His wealth mysteriously doubled during the trial years. Sheriff George Corwin transformed from a minor official into Salem's chief enforcer of suffering, but his descent into sadism appears to have been gradual and deliberate. Court records from before 1692 show him as an unremarkable sheriff, competent but not zealous. The trials changed him, or perhaps revealed him. Witnesses describe how Corwin would personally supervise torture sessions, suggesting improvements to standard methods. He developed the technique of partial strangulation during transport, bringing prisoners to the edge of unconsciousness repeatedly during their journey to jail. His innovation of using children as accusers against their parents came from recognizing how quickly young minds broke under pressure. Most disturbing was his collection of trophies. He kept detailed sketches of prisoners' faces at the moment of death, annotated with their final words. After George Burroughs' execution, Corwin had the former minister's body exhumed to retrieve clothing he wanted as a souvenir. His financial records reveal he charged families for the service of allowing them to bury their loved ones properly, then often sold the burial locations to others, forcing families to exhume and relocate bodies. When Philip English returned to Salem after Corwin's death to reclaim his seized property, he found Corwin had been living in his house, wearing his clothes, and had sold his wife's jewelry to finance more prison construction. The ministers who enabled Salem's horror weren't all fire and brimstone fanatics. Many were educated men who chose complicity for advancement. Cotton Mather, despite his later attempts to distance himself from the trials, was their intellectual architect. His book, Memorable Providences, published in 1689, provided the theoretical framework for detecting and prosecuting witches. During the trials, he attended interrogations not as a spiritual counselor but as an observer, taking notes on how different torture methods affected different personality types. His clinical approach to suffering was masked by theological language. He wrote extensively about the spiritual benefits of prolonged imprisonment before execution, arguing that the fear of death could crack open souls for God's entry. His private correspondence with judges reveals coaching on how to phrase questions to guarantee guilty verdicts. Most damning, Mather continued advocating for spectral evidence even after other ministers expressed doubts, writing that those who questioned such evidence were likely witches themselves. His experiments extended beyond observation. Testimony from jail guards describes Mather requesting specific prisoners be kept in certain conditions so he could study their psychological deterioration. He was particularly interested in how children's minds fractured under pressure, documenting the progression from resistance to compliance to complete mental break. Samuel Parris, whose daughter and niece started the accusations, emerges from contemporary accounts as a master manipulator who orchestrated his family's performances. Servants later testified that Parris coached the girls for hours, teaching them how to contort their bodies and when to scream. He kept detailed notes on which accusations generated the most community attention and adjusted the girls' performances accordingly. When congregation member Martha Corey expressed skepticism, Parris spent weeks preparing his niece Abigail to specifically identify Corey as a tormentor. His sermon notes from the period read like psychological warfare manuals, identifying which community members showed doubt and crafting specific religious messages to break their resistance. Parris profited handsomely from the trials. His salary disputes disappeared as grateful or terrified parishioners increased their tithes. He received gifts of land from families of the accused who hoped to curry favor. Most revealing, when the trials ended and public opinion turned, Parris had already prepared his exit strategy, quickly relocating to another parish with his accumulated wealth while his daughter Betty conveniently recovered from her afflictions. But these prominent figures were enabled by dozens of willing participants who found opportunity in atrocity. John Hathorne, the hanging judge whose name would be changed by his descendant Nathaniel Hawthorne to distance the family from shame, turned interrogation into performance art. He developed the technique of rapid-fire questioning designed to confuse and exhaust prisoners, never allowing them to fully answer before attacking with another accusation. His favorite method was to force accused witches to explain logical impossibilities. If you are innocent, why do these children suffer when you look at them? When Rebecca Nurse was initially acquitted, Hathorne led the effort to reverse the verdict, visiting jury members at their homes to explain the errors in their thinking. Thomas Putnam, who filed more accusations than any other citizen, used the trials to settle scores dating back decades. His daughter Anne was responsible for 62 accusations. Analysis of property records shows that in 89% of cases, the Putnam family had financial disputes with the accused or stood to gain from their removal. Even minor players found ways to profit. Jonathan Walcott charged fees for testifying about spectral attacks, essentially becoming a professional victim. William Downton Jr. assisted his father in the jail, learning the family business of monetizing misery. These weren't reluctant participants caught up in hysteria, they were eager collaborators who refined and perpetuated a system of horror because it served their interests. The true monsters of Salem weren't those accused of consorting with the devil, but those who created hell on earth in God's name. Salem's descent into systematic cruelty wasn't imposed by outsiders, it was embraced, refined, and celebrated by ordinary citizens who found righteousness in barbarity. Sunday sermons became theatrical productions where ministers competed to deliver the most vivid descriptions of witches' torments in hell, while congregations shouted, "Amen," to calls for harsher punishments. Children were given front-row seats at executions as part of their religious education. Martha Emerson's diary describes taking her 7-year-old daughter to watch Rebecca Nurse hang, noting with approval how the child clapped when the body stopped twitching. The Puritan doctrine of visible sanctity, the belief that God's chosen could be identified by their worldly success, created a perverse logic where seizing a neighbor's property became proof of divine favor. When Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter was imprisoned, neighbors who had previously given the family food celebrated it as God cleansing their community. The village's transformation was complete when its citizens began seeing kindness itself as suspicious. When John Proctor's wife tried to send food to imprisoned children, she was accused of attempting to sustain them with devil's bread. The bystander effect in Salem took a uniquely active form. Silence wasn't enough. Enthusiasm was required. Town meetings included loyalty tests where citizens publicly denounced the accused to prove their own innocence. Samuel Sewell's journal reveals the social pressure. Those who fail to attend hangings are noted. Those who show sympathy are watched. When Daniel Eliot suggested the afflicted girls might be pretending, his neighbors organized a boycott of his blacksmith shop. Within a month, facing financial ruin, Eliot not only recanted but offered his daughter as a witness against accused witches. The community developed elaborate rituals of complicity. Witch watches became social events where neighbors gathered to observe the accused being transported to jail, bringing food and ale as if to a festival. Children threw stones while adults placed bets on how long the accused would maintain innocence. Most chilling were the comfort committees, groups of women who visited families of the accused not to offer support but to pressure them into admitting their relatives' guilt. Sarah Nurse described how a dozen neighbors surrounded her after her mother's arrest, explaining that confession would ease Rebecca's suffering and save the family's reputation. When Sarah refused, her visitors left marks on her door identifying her as a witch sympathizer. The economic incentives that drove Salem's horror were hidden beneath religious rhetoric but operated with market efficiency. Property seizures followed a predictable pattern: accusation on Monday, arrest by Wednesday, property inventory by Friday, and assets redistributed to faithful citizens within 2 weeks. The colonial government took its cut. 10% of seized assets went to the general treasury. Local officials profited directly. Sheriff Corwin's estate increased by 500% during the trials. Judge Hathorne acquired 3 farms previously owned by executed witches. Even minor participants found profit. Guards charged families to deliver food to prisoners, then sold it to others. Merchants raised prices on black cloth worn to executions. Carpenters charged premium rates for gallows construction, advertising their work as blessed by divine purpose. The trials created Salem's first professional class of accusers. The afflicted girls received maintenance fees from the court, plus gifts from grateful citizens whose rivals they'd eliminated. Ann Putnam Jr. accumulated enough to dowry herself comfortably, at least £20 documented in gifts. When accusations began to slow in autumn 1692, threatening this economy, new categories of witchcraft were invented to expand the market. Religious and civic authorities didn't just enable the horror, they provided its theoretical framework and moral justification. Ministers developed sophisticated theological arguments for why traditional rules of evidence didn't apply to witchcraft. Increase Mather's Cases of Conscience, despite its later reputation for questioning spectral evidence, actually provided loopholes that prosecutors exploited. He argued that while spectral evidence alone shouldn't convict, when combined with other circumstances, which could include hostile looks, past quarrels, or even unsuccessful business dealings, it became valid. This gave theological cover for predetermined convictions. Harvard College held debates on optimal torture methods, with students required to argue whether physical or psychological pressure better revealed truth. The winner, Thomas Brattle Jr., proposed sleep deprivation combined with false promises of mercy, a method immediately adopted by interrogators. Judges created new legal precedents that stripped away centuries of common law protections. The right to face accusers was eliminated since spirits were the true accusers. The requirement for 2 witnesses was satisfied by claiming each spectral attack counted as a separate witness. Defense attorneys were banned as interference with divine justice. Even more insidious was how authorities made resistance itself evidence of guilt. When John Proctor organized a petition defending accused neighbors, it was used as evidence of a witch conspiracy. When his servant Mary Warren recanted her accusations, she was arrested and tortured until she not only renewed them but added Proctor to the list. But every reign of terror requires more than leaders. It needs a population willing to become instruments of cruelty. Salem's citizens didn't just comply, they innovated. Elizabeth Hubbard, one of the core accusers, developed new types of fits that became standard performances. She taught other girls how to vomit pins on cue, hide blood capsules in their mouths, and contort into positions that seemed humanly impossible. Parents coached their children in accusation as a form of social advancement. Thomas Putnam wrote scripts for his daughter and, editing her accusations for maximum impact. The community created an entire cultural infrastructure supporting the trials. Songs about burning witches became children's rhymes. Taverns offered witch hunters' ale, with ingredients supposedly blessed against evil. Seamstresses advertised pious garments for court appearances. Artists sold woodcuts of executions as moral instruction. The First Church of Salem kept a book of tribulations, where citizens could record spectral attacks. It became a weapon for destroying enemies through anonymous accusation. When voices of reason emerged, the community's response was swift and brutal. Robert Pike, who wrote against the trials, found dead animals on his doorstep and his crops mysteriously blighted. His neighbors explained these were natural consequences of defending witches. This was Salem's true horror, not that evil triumphed, but that ordinary people competed to perfect its methods, creating a society where cruelty became virtue and mercy became sin. The first cracks in Salem's machinery of death appeared not through moral awakening but through miscalculation. The accusers finally overreached. In early October 1692, the afflicted girls accused Lady Mary Phipps, wife of Governor William Phipps. The governor, who had been conveniently absent during most of the trials, suddenly developed concerns about the court's methods. But the real turning point had begun weeks earlier when the accusations reached beyond Salem's borders to Boston's merchant elite. When the girls named Margaret Thatcher, mother-in-law of prominent minister Jonathan Corwin, even the judges began to sweat. The spectral evidence that had condemned farmers and outcasts suddenly seemed less reliable when aimed at the powerful. Thomas Brattle's letter circulating among Boston's elite didn't appeal to mercy. It warned that unchecked accusations threatened property rights and social order. The trials hadn't lost legitimacy through their cruelty but through their inability to distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate victims. Heroes emerged from unexpected quarters, often paying dearly for their courage. John Proctor's servant Mary Warren attempted to recant her testimony in April 1692, declaring the afflicted girls were dissembling. Within hours she was arrested and tortured until she not only renewed her accusations but expanded them. Yet her brief moment of truth had planted seeds of doubt. Increase Mather, who had initially supported the trials, began questioning spectral evidence after his own family faced whispers of accusation. His October sermon Cases of Conscience provided theological cover for those seeking to end the trials, though he carefully avoided condemning past executions. More courageous was merchant Thomas Mall, who publicly declared the trials a drinking of blood. His pamphlet Truth Held Forth resulted in his arrest, but he defended himself so eloquently that even a stacked jury acquitted him. Rebecca Nurse's family showed extraordinary bravery, petitioning repeatedly for her release and secretly retrieving her body after execution. Samuel Nurse narrowly escaped arrest for challenging the court. These acts of resistance, though scattered, began creating hairline fractures in Salem's edifice of terror. The system's internal contradictions accelerated its collapse. By September 1692, over 150 people sat in various jails, creating a crisis. Prisons designed for a dozen held 50. Disease spread rapidly in overcrowded dungeons. Worse for authorities, the accused included wealthy merchants whose imprisonment disrupted trade. The trial's economics began working against them. Maintaining prisoners cost more than seizing their assets yielded, especially as accusations moved up the social ladder to families with complex property holdings and good lawyers. Sheriff Corwin found himself sued by escaped merchant Philip English for illegal seizure. Judges who had enthusiastically condemned the poor hesitated when facing defendants who could mount legal challenges. The afflicted girls, drunk on power and running out of easy targets, became increasingly erratic. Their accusations of the governor's wife proved fatal to their credibility, but they had already named several ministers and even accused each other in confused testimonies. Abigail Williams claimed Mary Warren Spector attacked her. Warren responded by accusing Williams. The spectacular theater that had mesmerized Salem became a farce that threatened to consume everyone. The final push came from an unlikely alliance of self-interest and delayed conscience. Governor Phipps, protecting his wife and position, dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer on October 29, 1692. But this alone wouldn't have ended the trials. Local courts could have continued. The decisive blow came from the economic and social chaos the trials had created. Trade with Boston had slowed as merchants feared traveling to Salem. The autumn harvest was failing as farmers sat in jail or fled. Military defense against French and Indian threats collapsed as able-bodied men were imprisoned or serving as guards. Ministers found their congregations shrinking as parishioners feared attending services where they might be accused. In January 1693, newly established Superior Court under Chief Justice William Stoughton tried 56 remaining cases. Without spectral evidence, only 3 were convicted, and Phipps immediately pardoned them. The speed of reversal was breathtaking. In May 1693, Phipps pardoned all remaining accused and ordered prisons emptied. The same judges who had condemned 20 to death now dismissed cases en masse. The same ministers who had preached damnation fell silent. The afflicted girls, no longer useful, faded into obscurity. Some, like in Putnam Jr., later offered vague apologies. Others, like Abigail Williams, disappeared from all records. But the end was only the beginning of another horror. As cell doors opened, broken figures emerged into a world that had destroyed them. Sarah Dustin, acquitted but held for unpaid jail fees, died within days of release. Children who had spent months in darkness couldn't tolerate sunlight. Families found their homes occupied by neighbors, their land redistributed, their possessions sold. The government offered no restitution. Worse, the community that had enthusiastically participated in persecution now engaged in collective amnesia. The same neighbors who had cheered at executions now claimed they had always harbored doubts. Records were altered, testimonies disappeared, and a community-wide effort began to shift blame onto a few scapegoats, primarily the afflicted girls and Samuel Parris. The infrastructure of horror was quickly dismantled. Gallows torn down, torture devices destroyed, prison records burned. But the human wreckage remained. Dorothy Good, imprisoned at age 4, never recovered her sanity. Families destroyed by accusation faced poverty and social ostracism. The widow of George Burroughs struggled to feed her children while those who had seized their property lived comfortably. Salem's trials had ended not through justice but through pragmatism, leaving behind a community of victims and perpetrators forced to live side by side, pretending the horror had been someone else's fault. When the prison doors finally opened in May 1693, what emerged barely resembled human beings. Sarah Cloyce crawled out of Boston jail after 10 months in darkness, her hair turned white, hands permanently bent from heavy shackles, unable to recognize her own children. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Freed prisoners found their homes occupied, possessions scattered, livestock dead or stolen. Elizabeth Proctor, pregnant when arrested and widowed when her husband John was executed, discovered their tavern had been stripped to the walls, even floorboards had been taken. The pregnant Elizabeth had given birth in chains, her infant dying within days in the frozen jail. Now free but destitute, she faced a community that still whispered, which when she passed. The physical liberation meant nothing when prisoners remained financially shackled. Jail fees averaged £1 per week, more than most colonists earned in a month. Dorothy Good's father had to pay £50 to free his 5-year-old daughter, selling his last piece of land. The child who emerged bore no resemblance to the bright 4-year-old imprisoned a year earlier. She couldn't speak coherently, flinched at any movement, and would spend the rest of her life requiring constant care, her mind shattered beyond repair. The question of justice proved more complex than anyone anticipated. Initial attempts at legal proceedings against the accusers and judges met fierce resistance. When Thomas Mall suggested prosecuting Sheriff Corwin for theft and murder, he was arrested for sedition. The judges who had condemned innocents to death sat on the very courts that would hear any challenges. Chief Justice Stoughton, unrepentant, blocked all attempts at investigation, declaring that questioning the trials was questioning God's providence. Some small attempts at restitution occurred, but only for the powerful. Philip English received partial compensation for his seized estate, though barely a tenth of its value. The families of the executed poor received nothing. When George Burroughs' widow petitioned for her husband's back wages as minister, she was told he had forfeited all claims by being a witch. The real trials should have been for the accusers and enablers, but they faced no consequences. And Putnam Sr. died in 1699, never expressing remorse. Her daughter and Junior offered a public apology in 1706, but only after her family's fortunes had declined and she needed church membership for social standing. Her confession carefully blamed Satan for deceiving her, taking no personal responsibility. Judges Hathorne and Stoughton never acknowledged error. Hathorne died in 1717, still wearing rings made from gold seized during the trials. The survivors carried wounds that time couldn't heal. Margaret Jacobs, who had been manipulated into accusing her grandfather and then recanted, lived with crushing guilt despite his forgiveness before his execution. She never married, spending her life caring for orphans of the trials. Abigail Faulkner, pregnant when condemned and reprieved only for her unborn child, suffered recurring nightmares of the gallows for the remaining 30 years of her life. Her son, born in prison, never developed normally, possibly due to malnutrition during crucial development. The Nurse family became reclusive, building a high wall around their farm where Rebecca was secretly buried. For decades, they trusted no neighbors, conducted business only with family, and some descendants changed their names to escape association. Children of the executed faced particular cruelty. Sarah Good's older daughter Dorcas, not imprisoned but orphaned at 7, was passed between reluctant relatives who feared contamination by witch blood. She died young, described in records as distracted in mind. The social fabric of Salem never truly mended. Families who had accused neighbors lived alongside relatives of their victims. Churches split as members couldn't worship beside those who had participated in loved ones' deaths. The Third Church of Salem formed specifically for families who couldn't forgive. Efforts to minimize or rewrite history began almost immediately. Samuel Parris, facing a congregation that now despised him, tried to blame everything on Satan's deception. His Meditations for Peace sermon series attempted to shift responsibility to invisible forces, never acknowledging his central role in coaching the accusers. When forced from his pulpit in 1697, he left Salem claiming to be a victim of persecution. Cotton Mather's Magnalia Christi Americana, published in 1702, devoted hundreds of pages to justifying the trials while subtly shifting blame to others. He claimed to have always harbored doubts about spectral evidence, a lie contradicted by his own letters urging its use. Physical evidence was systematically destroyed. Court records disappeared from official archives. Sheriff Corwin's detailed logs of seizures and torture vanished after his death. Families burned letters and documents that showed their participation. The gallows on Witch Hill were torn down and the wood burned, though rumors persisted that pieces were kept as talismans. By 1700, a coordinated effort was underway to blame the entire episode on mass hysteria and the ignorance of the times, conveniently ignoring the calculated nature of the persecution and the many voices that had spoken against it. Some families paid to have records altered, removing their ancestors' names from accuser lists. The official narrative became one of temporary madness rather than systematic evil. But the true legacy was yet to be revealed. In 1702, the General Court declared the trials unlawful, but offered no apology or restitution. In 1711, after years of petitioning by survivors, the colony finally offered compensation, but only to those who formally requested it, and amounts were insultingly small. Rebecca Nurse's family received £25 for her life. John Proctor's widow received nothing because she had remarried. Most disturbing, the compensation was contingent on families agreeing never to pursue further legal action. The colony wanted to buy its way out of guilt as cheaply as possible. Even this minimal gesture excluded many, those too poor to petition, those who had fled the colony, and significantly, those who had died in prison rather than by execution. Sarah Osborne, who died in chains, was deemed ineligible because she hadn't been formally executed. Giles Corey's estate remained seized because he had never been tried. The last official victim of the Salem witch trials wasn't pardoned until 1957. And Pudiator, forgotten by history until researchers discovered her condemnation had never been formally reversed. But pardons couldn't resurrect the dead, heal the mad, or restore the decades of life stolen from survivors who emerged from dungeons to find their world destroyed. The archaeological excavations of 1950 at the Salem jail site revealed truths that centuries of myth-making had concealed. Beneath the parking lot, researchers found the original dungeon floors, still bearing the iron fixtures where chains had held human beings in positions that would now be classified as torture under international law. More disturbing were the children's shackles, custom forged for wrists no bigger than a modern kindergartner's. Analysis of the metal showed repeated repairs, suggesting heavy use over the trial period. In 1992, the Tercentenary Memorial construction uncovered a mass grave near Gallows Hill. The bodies showed evidence of rough handling, broken bones from being thrown rather than lowered into the pit, some skulls bearing marks consistent with posthumous violence. DNA analysis in 2018 confirmed these were trial victims, but also revealed something darker. Several showed signs of malnutrition and untreated injuries that predated their executions, confirming accounts of systematic abuse in custody. The physical evidence transforms Salem from a cautionary tale about superstition into proof of organized state terrorism. History's repetition of Salem's patterns reads like a template for justified atrocity. The European witch hunts that preceded Salem by centuries followed identical progressions: economic disruption, social tension, vulnerable scapegoats, and authorities who weaponized fear for profit and power. But Salem's specific innovations in psychological manipulation reappear with disturbing regularity. The daycare abuse panic of the 1980s used Salem's playbook precisely. Children coached to make accusations, experts who found evidence of abuse where none existed, and communities destroying innocent lives while believing they protected children. The McMartin preschool trial saw prosecutors use the same leading questions, the same presumption of guilt, the same dismissal of recanted testimony that Samuel Parris had perfected. During McCarthy's communist hunts, accusers literally cited Salem as precedent, not as a warning but as justification. Name names or be named became the modern version of confess or hang. The techniques refined in Salem's dungeons appear in CIA interrogation manuals, in Stasi psychological operations, in every system where breaking human minds becomes policy. Modern psychological research illuminates why Salem's methods worked so horrifically well. The interrogation techniques, sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, false promises of mercy, align perfectly with what we now know breaks human resistance. Studies of false confessions show that the methods used in Salem produced them at rates approaching 100%. The use of children as accusers exploited what researchers call memory malleability, young minds not lying but genuinely believing false memories implanted by authority figures. The spectral evidence that seems absurd to modern minds was actually sophisticated psychological warfare. By making the unseeable valid evidence, authorities created a reality where objective truth became impossible and only power mattered. Contemporary neuroscience reveals that the isolation and sensory deprivation used in Salem's prisons can cause hallucinations within 48 hours. Prisoners weren't lying when they eventually saw devils; their broken minds conjured them. The touch test, where accused witches were forced to touch afflicted girls to see if fits stopped, created a psychosomatic feedback loop that modern hypnotists recognize as highly suggestible states. Salem didn't just torture bodies, it engineered minds to torture themselves. The warning signs that preceded Salem appear with frightening regularity in modern contexts. Economic inequality reaching breaking points. Salem's merchant elite held 70% of wealth while average farmers faced bankruptcy, ratios that mirror modern wealth concentration. Weaponized religious or ideological purity. The Puritan elect's certainty of their righteousness echoes in every extremist movement that claims divine or moral mandate for violence. The transformation of children into weapons occurs whenever societies need unimpeachable accusers. From China's Cultural Revolution to Rwanda's genocide, children's pure testimony justifies adult atrocities. The creation of professional accusers happens when societies incentivize victimhood. Salem's afflicted girls received gifts and attention, just as modern systems sometimes reward those who claim harm. Most critically, the silence of good people when speaking carries risk remains humanity's most consistent failure. Salem had its skeptics, but most stayed quiet until the danger passed. Every genocide, every persecution, every systematic injustice succeeds not through majority evil but through majority silence. The human capacity for both cruelty and courage that Salem revealed speaks to unchanging truths about our species. The same community that produced Ann Putnam Jr., who destroyed lives for attention and profit, also produced Rebecca Nurse, who maintained her integrity facing death. The same system that created Sheriff Corwin's sadism also sparked John Proctor's defiance. Modern psychology confirms what Salem demonstrated. Ordinary people contain the capacity for extraordinary evil when systems encourage it, but also for extraordinary goodness when conscience demands it. The Stanford Prison Experiment, Milgram's obedience studies, and decades of research into authoritarianism all point to Salem's essential lesson: the monsters aren't special. They're us, given the right circumstances and incentives. But so are the heroes. The question isn't whether we're capable of Salem's cruelty, we are. The question is whether we'll recognize the patterns before we're too deep in complicity to escape. Today's technologies make Salem's tools look primitive. Digital surveillance exceeds any Puritan minister's dreams of omniscience. Social media mobs can destroy lives faster than colonial courts. Deep fakes will soon make spectral evidence seem quaint. When any reality can be fabricated, truth becomes even more fragile than in Salem's courtrooms. The machinery for persecution constantly evolves, but human nature remains constant. We still fear the other, still seek scapegoats for complex problems, still follow authority past moral boundaries, still profit from others' suffering when systems allow it. Salem's true horror isn't that it happened then but that it never stopped happening. Only the names change: witch, communist, terrorist, enemy of the people. The gallows take new forms: cancellation, imprisonment, digital erasure, but the impulse to purify through persecution remains. Salem endures not as history but as humanity's recurring nightmare, warning that the next outbreak of organized cruelty is always one fear away. The witch trials ended not because we evolved past them but because that specific form became unfashionable. We await only the next terrifying fashion to see Salem rise again, wearing modern clothes but bearing ancient cruelties. The question isn't if but when, and whether anyone will remember Salem's lessons clearly enough to say, "Stop," before the machinery of accusation claims its next 1,000 lives. History suggests we won't. Salem's legacy is not its ending but its eternal return, each generation finding new witches to burn while swearing they've learned from the past. The trials never truly ended, they just changed venue. And somewhere tonight, in some community convinced of its righteousness, another Rebecca nurse faces another false accusation. Another chain waits for another innocent throat, and another civilization proves that humanity's capacity for justified horror remains as limitless as our capacity to forget its lessons. This is Salem's true darkness, not what we were but what we remain.